all know how this unfortunate population has been abused and over-abused for the past 60 years.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with a May Day march for immigrant rights in New Haven, Connecticut. Many hundreds turned out, and there was large participation from several unions. Then to the Russell Tribunal, which met some time ago to make findings on the treatment of Palestinians and the whole situation of Palestine, Israel. We have two speeches for you today, one by a hero of the French resistance in World War II, Stéphane Hessel. The other by a young man who's been doing some excellent reporting about Palestine, Israel, Ben White. Following that, video from a drone march, a funeral march, a protest outside the Hancock Air Force Base near Syracuse. Hancock is a drone center and a site of frequent protests. We'll end with an ominous chart which shows the steady progression of mankind towards climate catastrophe. We begin in New Haven, Connecticut. There seems to be a lot of support in Congress and even among heads of labor unions for a bill created by the so-called Gang of Eight that would allow an expensive 13-year process towards legalization of undocumented immigrants. There are many strings attached, more and more walls and security on the border with Mexico, billions spent for border cops and triple-layer fencing, making the area a near war zone, even though not a single terrorist has entered the U.S. or Mexico. On the other hand, in 2012, there were 477 deaths among border crossers. There will also be a requirement for a biometric ID card for everyone, citizen and non-citizen, as a condition for applying for work. And why do we care about borders anyway? In most of Europe, a person can go from one country to another without any fuss about papers. Security? The Boston bombers were all in this country legally, as were the people who flew the planes into the World Trade Center. Not every undocumented immigrant will even qualify for the legalization program. Because to be in it, you have to prove you've been living in the U.S. continuously since 2011. Studies show that some 3 million of the undocumented will not qualify and will either be deported or be driven deep underground, making it even easier for employers to cheat them at work.
We don't want crumbs from the table. We don't want handouts. What we want is a process and a pathway to citizenship and a pathway to a good job. That's what we want. We also don't want a few selected rights that there could be loopholes in. We want real reform. We don't want a few selected rights. We want a fair worker authorization system so labor laws protect the people. That's what we want. How do we get that, folks? We get that by standing together. We get that by standing together, not just today. We get it by standing together and doing collective actions like this. This is something this country needs to see everywhere. This country needs to see people, right, of every religion, of every color, of every neighborhood. That's what this country needs.
Why don't we try to understand why Latinos are coming to this country anyway? Could it have something to do with our 1% destroying the livelihoods in those countries? With our drug war and our NAFTA and our support for coups and death squads. Our slogans should simply be, stop the deportations, tear down the walls. We're very proud to show a few minutes of a talk at the Russell Tribunal on Palestine by Stefan Hessel. Hessel, who died in February at the age of 95, was born in Germany. He became an immigrant to France. When World War II started and France was conquered by Germany, Hessel joined up with Charles de Gaulle and became a leader in the French resistance. He was eventually captured and tortured, even by waterboarding. He eventually escaped a German concentration camp. After World War II, he helped edit the Declaration of Human Rights, one of the proudest achievements of human civilization. In 2009, he condemned the Israeli war on Gaza, calling the attacks that year a crime against humanity.
Citoyens et citoyennes, citizens, male and female, nous vous encourageons par votre web. It is a very special session. We are meeting at a time when the General Assembly of the United Nations is meeting in this city and is able to try to bring forward a better knowledge everywhere of the basic human principles and international law. We are privileged, you are all privileged, to live in a world that for over 60 years now has a United Nations where the basic principles are there. And that is a great thing for all of us. We can base our work on that and say, let us go forward. On the question of Palestine, it is not necessary to dwell. You all know how this unfortunate population has been abused and over-abused for the past 60 years, and with nobody to really be there to help it achieve at last the statehood that it deserves. What we want to do here, today and tomorrow and the day after, is to make clear that not only the government of the United States, but the United Nations as a whole has not been able to do more than to draft resolutions, to say what should be done, and to do nothing that it can actually be done. We want to put a new impulse on the media particularly, and on all of you, each one of you, you can all help, so that this impossible situation and that this impunity that is reached to Israel, not only by the United Nations but by the United States, should find an end. If we achieve some progress in that, thanks to you being there listening to us, then the day will have been worth living. Thank you.
Next is Ben White, graduate of Cambridge University, a freelance writer who specializes in Palestine, Israel. His latest book is Palestinians in Israel: Segregation, Discrimination, and Democracy.
Try and be concise but also useful in what I'm going to be bringing to you all. I'm going to begin just by touching on a few elements of what it means for Israel to be defined as a Jewish state, and obviously specifically the implications of that for the Palestinian people. I wanted to begin that by pointing out the way in which in the very first few years of the state's establishment, key laws that were passed, particularly the law of return, the absentee property law and the citizenship law, were the sort of foundation stones for a regime of exclusion, and were defining who was in and who was out in this new state, and those laws being instrumental in dispossessing the expelled Palestinians, and obviously also opening up the borders of the state to Jews around the world. I think, as has been noted already during this session today, Israel doesn't have a formal constitution, and something has been mentioned of the basic laws that Israel has passed, which obviously kind of regulate various aspects of the state, like the role of the Knesset and the army and so forth. I just wanted to mention one basic law, the Basic Law Human Dignity and Liberty from 1992, which is a useful way of highlighting the disparity or the problematic nature of the relationship between Israel's identity as both Jewish and democratic. Because this basic law, while on the surface offering some sort of protection to minorities within the state, actually has an important qualifying clause within the basic law that effectively says those rights can be abrogated in the event that it is important to protect the nature of Israel as a Jewish state. Also just wanted to mention, for example, within the context of Israel's definition as a Jewish state and protecting that, the fact that a few years ago in 2007, it was revealed via the Prime Minister's office how the Shin Bet, the internal security within Israel, was openly talking about how they would, quote, thwart the activity of any group or individual seeking to harm the Jewish and democratic character of the State of Israel, even if such activity is sanctioned by the law. Okay, so the kind of, and that was an open declaration that the Shin Bet was making. I also wanted to mention the role of para-state bodies like the Jewish National Fund, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, whose relationship with the state since 1948 has also been very important in being kind of part of the instruments of colonization and dispossession, and the way in which those bodies are delegated functions and responsibilities that would normally be part of the state's responsibility. But in Israel's case, those tasks are delegated to bodies that are constitutionally mandated to benefit only one group of people. I'm going to move on to looking at some specifics in terms of Israeli policies. And you'll notice, of course, that given the title, Israeli Policies since 1948, I have to address policies that have affected Palestinians in the 48 area, in pre-67 Israel's borders, Palestinian citizens, but also Israeli policies in the West Bank and Gaza too. And I'll just make a point now that I'll return to at the end, which is it's very important for us to see the ways in which, even when different legal mechanisms are being used, that the main focus of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, whether they have citizenship or whether they are citizenship-less and under military rule in the West Bank and Gaza, the main focus of Israeli policies remains the same. Establish a regime that benefits one group at the expense of another, with regards to land and natural resources and other things. So, of course, after 1948, and we've already had mention of the Nakba already today, but after the ethnic cleansing that took place, bearing in mind, of course, that it was only the ethnic cleansing of 1948 that enabled the establishment of a Jewish majority in the first place. After that, a number of laws, some of which I've mentioned already, were used to further the expropriation of land from the Palestinian population, and not just the Palestinians who had been expelled, but also from Palestinians who had remained and become citizens, and effectively the transference of Palestinian-owned land into the hands of the state, sometimes via those organizations I mentioned, the para-state organizations. Quote-unquote abandoned Palestinian property was given over for the establishment of new Jewish communities. And, for example, in areas like Naqab, the Negev in the south, the remaining Bedouin Palestinians were confined to an area that was referred to as the fence, in order for the area that they had been occupying to be freed up for Jewish settlement. And Ilan mentioned the military regime that existed till '66. I also wanted to mention the fact that until today, the Israeli state has a focus or an interest in what it refers to as Judaization of areas like the Negev and the Galilee, areas that have kept a relatively high number of Palestinian citizens compared to other areas of the state. and therefore are a focus for the state's anxiety with regards to the demographic battle in the state's perspective. That discourse of the demographic threat is commonplace amongst Israeli academics, think tanks, politicians, laypersons, the general public. The idea that Palestinians with citizenship are a threat to the state simply by the fact that they are Palestinians. And if you're wanting to see how that works out in practice, then you can remember the fact that the law that currently means that Palestinian citizens, Israeli citizens, can't legally live with their spouse if that spouse is a Palestinian from the West Bank and Gaza. The motivation for that law is not security, but a desire to make sure that Palestinians don't gain citizenship through marriage in the context of the demographic struggle. And then, of course, what happened after 1967 was that the same colonial logic was extended to the West Bank and Gaza, remembering West Bank including East Jerusalem too. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with what's happened since 67 in terms of the creation and consolidation of the colonies, the illegal settlements. Subsequently, that regime has been expanded to include the separation wall, the road network that connects the settlements to each other, various other kind of ways of limiting Palestinian access to territories, such as the creation of areas reserved for the Israeli military to train in, and these sorts of things. And to the extent that by now, in 2012, you have the existence of a de facto one state, a de facto single regime from the river to the sea, where the Israeli state sets policies that discriminate and make a difference on people's lives depending on where they are and what sort of ID they have and what ethnicity they are. I'm going to touch upon as well, just I want briefly, economic marginalization and the way in which the Israeli state has targeted Palestinian economic, the ability for Palestinians to generate kind of independent economics, not just within the West Bank and Gaza, but also inside 48 area as well. There are tons of statistics to show the levels of inequality between Jewish and Palestinian citizens within 48. Just to give you a couple of examples of these. In 2003, this figure was from close to half of all Palestinian families lived in poverty compared to around 1 in 5 Jewish Israeli families. In 2010, Palestinian citizens accounted for 1/3 of all poor people in Israel. Out of the 30 communities in Israel with the most unemployment, 27 of them are Palestinian communities, and you could go on with this sort of list. Interestingly, actually, just as a kind of side note, although it's important, in the last few years there's been an emphasis by the Israeli state on encouraging economic growth within the Israeli Arab sector. And you have to realize that the reason for this is not a kind of sudden change in heart about some of the fundamental aspects of policy, but because the Israeli government itself realized that the way in which that the Palestinian sector had been kept down economically was actually inhibiting the ability of the state as a whole to grow to the extent that was required from an economic point of view, and the context of Israel's entry into the OECD as well. Let me just check how I'm doing on the time. There we go. When it comes to the West Bank and Gaza as well, it's a complete fallacy to think of the ability of an independent Palestinian economy, independent of the Israeli regime and independent of the occupation. That's because there is no practical means for the Palestinians to develop an independent economy. And you can find that even in the reports of publications by radical groups like the World Bank and the IMF, who will be quite clear, even in their own language, they'll be quite clear to say, look, you can pump as much aid as you want into the occupied territories, but there's never going to be a thriving independent economy while Israeli colonization and occupation practices persist. Okay, obviously they didn't say colonization. I'm going to mention as well the fact that when you're talking about the displacement of the Palestinians, you're not just talking about something that happened in history. Okay? It's an ongoing Nakba that didn't finish in 49 or 50 or even 67, but is carrying on today, and it carries on in both Israel proper and inside the occupied territories. And this again relates to what I was mentioning a bit earlier about understanding the nature of Israel's policies in this whole de facto one state. If you took a sample of events that have happened with regards to the displacement of Palestinians over the last few years, you'll notice that very similar things have happened to Palestinians in Nakab, in the south, in the same way that Palestinians in the Jordan Valley or the southern Hebron Hills have been expelled and had their properties demolished too. And in both cases, it's with the same goal in mind, that of furthering or enabling Jewish settlement and making sure that space is cleared for that, and marginalizing or eradicating the presence of the Palestinian communities there too. I just wanted to mention the fact that the reality of that forced displacement is reflected in the language and reports, again, of internationally respected human rights bodies. And this is the language that Amnesty International use. Quote, "The quartet must face the facts on the ground in the occupied West Bank, escalating demolitions and whole villages threatened with forced eviction." Right, then how about these words from the EU Parliament? The EU Parliament called earlier this year for, quote, "immediate end to house demolitions, evictions and forced displacement of Palestinians." Of course, whether that means the EU will then decide to actually make those realities of ongoing human rights abuses a factor in trade relations with Israel remains to be seen. But that is a positive development in the sense of the documentation of these policies by those sorts of bodies. And I wanted to mention, I think, something that maybe has been mentioned before, which was the report by the UN's Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination earlier this year. Very important report, which is, again, recommended for you all to read and download. And they use language like de facto segregation, talking about Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And the sorts of policies that the committee was analysing in Israel and the occupied territories were severe enough, again, in the language of the committee, to cause them to remind Israel of the prohibition on apartheid. And that was the kind of first time that sort of language had been used by that committee since the days of South African apartheid. So I'm going to round it up there in case there is time for a couple of quick questions. But just to kind of focus on that last section that I was talking about the ongoing Nakba and the fact that it didn't stop in 1948. And that's something that is important for both our analysis of what's going on, but also as a way of spurring people into action as well, because there's things that haven't happened yet that could be stopped. And we need to be able to look at what's happening there with a clear lens, a clear prism, that the question of Palestine is not just the siege of Gaza, it's not just the settlements in the West Bank, but it's a question of decolonization and democratization and the implementation of all the Palestinian people's historic rights that will bring an end to this ongoing Nakba.
In a future program, we'll show some of the talks at a forum about drones at Yale Law School. In fact, you can see it right now at our website, thestruggle.org. Especially look at the video of Ralph Nader, who asked a very provocative question. We close with a very alarming chart. It shows the steady upward progression of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. A safe level is 350, and we're steadily approaching 400. Next week, we'll show video from the talk at the Gandhi Peace Award by climate activist Bill McKibben. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.